The Ancient Kingdoms of Peru by Nigel Davies. Chapter 9, The Conquest. Kingdom Divided. It now remains to describe briefly the final episodes in the story of the Inca-dominated Peru. Atahualpa's victory in the Civil War was dramatic, but his triumph was fleeting. His lugubrious fate, together with that of the Mexican Moctezuma, has been dramatized in novels, dramas, operas, and even motion pictures. However decisive Atahualpa's victory against Huáscar, the Inca realm at the time of the Spanish conquest remained a divided kingdom, in which no final reconciliation had been achieved between the main factions. Surviving accounts, as we have seen, stress the gruesome ferocity of the Civil War. The chronicler Juan de Betanzos is unsparing in his criticism of Huáscar, whom he portrays as licentious and cruel. But he is scarcely more flattering when writing of Atahualpa, his own father-in-law, whose atrocities he also describes in detail. As a sample, perhaps apocryphal, of such savagery, he records that on Atahualpa's orders from the living bodies of the three Cañari chiefs, the hearts were cut out, chopped into very small pieces, and eaten by their attendants. The victor's vengeance was pitiless. Due to certain special ties that linked Huáscar and his grandfather, Tupac Inca, not only were the men and women of the ruler's Panaca slaughtered, but Tupac's own mummy was burned to cinders, an act of sacrilege so horrific as to be unthinkable in more settled times. The forces of Atahualpa even pillaged the shrines of the holy city of Cusco. Huáscar's rival, Atahualpa, was the confirmed favorite of the armies of the north, previously led by Huayna Cápac. Steeled by the rigors of endless campaigning against savage opponents, this force had proved to be the strongest in the empire. However, after its decisive triumph, little attempt was made to seek reconciliation with the defeated supporters of Huáscar, who had certainly enjoyed wide support not only in Cusco, but in many parts of the empire. The story of the Civil War tends to shed a new light on the almost Byzantine complexity of the process whereby potential heirs to the throne came to the fore. While Huáscar was also linked to Hanan Upper Cusco, which since the time of Pachacutec had tended to be the predominant moiety, the sources suggest that his main allegiance was to the traditional establishment of Urin, Lower Cusco. Hence, the elevation of Huáscar to the throne might be viewed as a kind of counter-revolution on behalf of the conservative religious hierarchy of Urin against the Anan military establishment, and in particular against Huayna Cápac's northern army. Such loyalties need to be considered in weighing the true situation in the Inca realm at the time of its destruction. Certain accounts might imply that the more traditional forces of Urin were in effect subject to the reformist Anan regime, deriving from the great Pachacutec. But the ascendancy of the military coterie of Tumebamba, a city now enjoying the status of a rival center of the world, created a grave situation for the Cuscan religious hierarchy, and the outbreak of civil war might have fostered in its leaders a mystical religious urge to restore their ascendancy. Cajamarca. However total Atahualpa's triumph, it was short-lived. At the very moment when he was celebrating the capture of his rival, Huáscar, he received ominous tidings of the approach of a small band of beings so strange that they might have come from outer space. Francisco Pizarro had landed at the head of a contingent, exiguous by Inca standards, of 62 horsemen and 106 foot soldiers. Having first captured the island of Puna, he crossed the Gulf of Guayaquil and stormed the city of Tumbes in a night attack. On September 24th, 1532, this minute but intrepid force set forth into the interior. Though they were still in territory not fully incorporated into the Inca Empire, the Civil War had left its mark upon its inhabitants. Towns were in ruins, and from the trees hung many bodies of defiant Indians loyal to Huáscar. Pizarro was by now no stranger to the coast of Ecuador. After a preliminary exploration in 1524 and a second voyage some 3 years later, which made few discoveries but suffered heavy casualties, he again set sail from Seville in 1530. After a wearisome march along the coast of Ecuador, he had eventually reached Puna. By a most extraordinary coincidence, Atahualpa and his forces were captured near Cajamarca, which happened to lie directly on Pizarro's line of march. The story of what followed may be briefly summarized in this context. In his detailed narrative of these events, John Hemming offers fascinating details of the bizarre and tragic clash between these two different worlds. Pizarro duly reached Cajamarca. One of the first buildings which he encountered was a sun temple, complete with a whole series of structures housing the mamaconas, or holy women. An eyewitness, Diego de Trujillo, relates that 500 of these temple virgins were paraded in the main square of Cajamarca. To the indignation of an envoy of Atahualpa who had already arrived on the scene, many were now offered to the Spaniards. The Spanish leader, anxious to proceed formally, then sent his brother Hernando Pizarro and Hernando de Soto to visit Atahualpa, accompanied by an Indian known as Martin, an interpreter acquired on Pizarro's previous voyage. A paved road ran for a few miles to Inca's headquarters, where he had established himself near a sulfur spring, beside which were some fairly small buildings where he resided. The first two Europeans ever to see the Inca were somewhat unnerved by the humiliation of being denied even the mere privilege of beholding his countenance. Two women had stretched a cloth in front of the ruler, through which he could see without being seen himself, according to the custom of these lords, who rarely allowed their vassals to look upon them. Notwithstanding De Soto's request that the cloth be lowered, the Inca merely bent low his head and communicated with him by means of a herald. Atahualpa even remained impervious when De Soto reared his horse so close that froth from its mouth soiled the ruler's clothes. Some of his guards, who had flinched at the sight of the outlandish beast, were promptly executed, together with all their families. At the end of the interview, chicha was served in 2 gold cups, one of which the Inca drained himself, while the other was offered to Hernando Pizarro. Fearing poison, he drank with hesitation. The same ritual was performed with De Soto, but with silver cups. Finally, Atahualpa promised to visit Cajamarca the following day. The Spaniards were by now becoming conscious of the power and sophistication of the empire that they had encountered. Isolated from the sea by a long march, they were now in the midst of a force with which De Soto and Pizarro estimated at 40,000. Notwithstanding their own military experience and skill, and the superiority of their weapons, the invaders had marched into an impasse. They were no doubt mindful of the tactic that has succeeded so well in Mexico, the kidnapping of the ruler. Though confronted with such odds, it would have been easier for the Inca to capture Pizarro. It was, therefore, agreed that the latter should decide on the spur of the moment on the best course of action once Atahualpa had arrived in Cajamarca. The city was ideally suited to the Spaniards' tentative plan. Long, low buildings occupied 3 sides of a main square, and in these Pizarro was able to station his cavalry in 3 contingents of 15 to 20 men. In contrast, Atahualpa had rather light-heartedly devised his visit to the exotic strangers as a kind of ceremonial pageant. He went accompanied by a large escort, according to many sources unarmed except for a small battle axes and slings concealed beneath their tunics. Miguel de Estete offers an eyewitness view by one of the first Europeans to see Atahualpa, and amply confirms the chroniclers' many accounts of the pomp and ceremony that surrounded his movements. In a very fine litter with the ends of its timbers covered in silver, came the figure of Atahualpa. 80 lords carried him on their shoulders, all wearing a rich blue livery. His own person was elaborately adorned with his crown on his head and a collar of large emeralds round his neck. He was seated on the litter, on a small stool with a rich saddle cushion. He stopped when he reached the middle of the square of Cajamarca, with his body half exposed. The litter was lined with parrot feathers of many colors and embellished with plates of gold and silver. Behind it came 2 other litters and 2 hammocks in which other leading persons traveled. Then came many men in squadrons with headdresses of gold and silver. When he reached Cajamarca, Atahualpa was most surprised to find not a single Spaniard. Eventually, the Dominican friar Vicente de Valverde emerged, accompanied by the interpreter Martin. According to most accounts, the Spaniard offered Atahualpa a breviary, which he briefly examined and then threw angrily to the ground. Upon this, Pizarro launched his ambush, and his cavalry charged into the mass of the emperor's lightly armed followers. Some resisted, but the mounted Spaniards managed to seize and overturn the royal litter, whose occupant was thus captured. The Spanish cavalry then charged out into the plain, and a carnage followed, in the course of which several thousand Indians perished. The story of what ensued has been told so often that it may be briefly summarized in this context. The following day, the Inca tried to extricate himself from his dire predicament by the offer of his famous ransom of a room 7 meters long and 5 meters wide to be filled with gold objects. Pizarro duly drew up a document that guaranteed Atahualpa's freedom if the gold was provided within a specified time. In compliance with this agreement, Quisquis, the Inca's commander in Cusco, received the order to strip the sacred buildings of all immediately portable gold objects and to dispatch these by special carriers to Cajamarca. Meanwhile, gold was gradually amassed and taken to Cusco from other parts of the empire for transportation to Cajamarca. Atahualpa appears to have suffered from a naive illusion that the Spaniards would honor their promise to release him in return for gold, even to the point of assuming that after setting him free they would simply pack up their spoils and depart forever. To expedite the completion of the contract, 3 conquistadors were sent to Cusco. Since no Indian would help them in this task, they themselves prized off 700 plates of gold that shielded the great temple of the sun, Coricancha, using copper crowbars. Among other precious objects, a great golden fountain that weighed over 12,000 pesos was dismantled and sent to Cajamarca. By the time the Spaniards had accumulated a massive hoard of gold, and on March 16, 1533, before even waiting for the treasure house to be filled, Pizarro ordered the process of melting down the precious metal to begin. A total of 11 tons was cast into the furnaces, including many exquisite objects, the masterpieces of the Inca goldsmiths. This produced a quota for each horseman of 40 kilos of gold, while foot soldiers received half this amount. The Spaniards, meanwhile, were fascinated by the elaborate rituals of the captive Inca's daily life and by the impeccable service that he continued to receive from his retinue. An eyewitness, Francisco de Cheres, relates that he was still held in awe by his subjects. Caciques would come from far and wide to pay their respects to their captive ruler, kissing his feet and hands. He would receive them impassively, not even deigning to look them in the face. Pizarro also treated him with the utmost respect and offered the services of a Dominican padre to instruct him in the Christian faith, as a means to achieving the salvation of his soul. When Atahualpa saw the relentless melting down of the accumulated treasure, his illusions vanished and he began to despair of previous hopes that his captors would fulfill their pledge to release him. Rumors then began to circulate among the Spaniards that Atahualpa was attempting to mobilize his northern armies, stationed in Ecuador under the command of Rumiñahui, in order that they might mount an expedition and liberate their master. Such reports, though vigorously denied by the Inca, greatly incensed the Spaniards. The latter were deeply divided as to whether the ruler should promptly be executed as a traitor to their cause. Some had grown fond of the captive, while others viewed him as a constant threat to their own safety. The method of dealing with the issue was wholly capricious. During a game of cards, a Nicaraguan Indian appeared who swore that he had seen the vast horde of native troops advancing upon Cajamarca. The governor, Pizarro, was thereby induced against his will to order the immediate death of Atahualpa. There had been no trial, and Pizarro merely succumbed to the demands of his own captain, Diego de Almagro, and the royal officials. The end was pitiless. As night was falling on July 26, 1533, Atahualpa was led into the middle of the square and tied to a stake. Pressed by the Friar Valverde, he requested baptism. As a consequence, instead of being burned alive, he was garroted by a piece of rope. Atahualpa was formally buried as a Christian in Cajamarca. Thereafter, however, a native force descended on the city, exhumed the Inca's body, and transported it for reburial in Quito, at that time controlled by Rumiñahui. The Conquest. By killing Atahualpa and Indianized, the Spaniards had cast themselves in the role of champions of Huascar, and as such enjoyed a degree of support among certain elements of the population. However, not only Ecuador, but also much of central Peru was controlled by Atahualpa's northern armies, commanded by his general Quisquis. Huascar himself had been killed by his own guards on the orders of Atahualpa, when the latter was already a Spanish captive. Their southward march was facilitated by the splendid highways built by the Incas. The Spaniards fought no fewer than 4 battles against these armies. After the final conclusive encounter in the mountains above Cusco, the forces of Quito simply lost heart and vanished. When they first beheld Cusco, the triumphant conquistadors described the buildings of the Inca capital, as they had previously done in Mexico, as of greater splendor than anything they had ever seen in Spain. The occupation of the outer marches of the empire presented fewer problems. In July 1535, Diego de Almagro left Cusco for Chile at the head of a well-equipped force, supported by great trains of porters, together with 12,000 Indians under the command of Paulu, a son of Huayna Capac. The march through Callao and Charcas met with scant resistance, since both provinces acknowledged the authority of Paulu as an heir to Huayna Capac. In Chile, there was some opposition, and isolated groups of Spaniards were ambushed and killed. Other forces fled to the extreme south, where Indian resistance even outlived Spanish colonial rule, and was only later crushed by the forces of the Chilean Republic in the 19th century. When the Spanish invaders were thus already in control of much of the central and southern part of the empire, the northern Inca forces still held out in Ecuador, now ruled with an iron hand by Rumiñahui, acting more as an independent condottiere than the loyal servants of the dead ruler and his heirs. During his master's captivity, Rumiñahui held the ruler's sons and many of his womenfolk in custody. Atahualpa has sent his brother in an attempt to rescue his children, but the prince was murdered by Rumiñahui, flayed, and his skin made into a drum. The Spaniards' attention was naturally drawn to this northern stronghold and its ruthless tyrant. Sebastian de Benalcazar set out from the coast. John Hemming, in his account of the conquest, describes what followed as the finest hour of the Inca resistance. Benalcazar occupied Tumebamba, where 3,000 Cañaris, still loyal to the cause of Huascar, joined his forces. The Spanish general continued his northern march, and at Teocajas, situated near a mountain pass at an altitude of 4,250 meters, was fought with the greatest pitched battle of the conquest. In this encounter, though the Inca force failed to stem the Spanish horsemen, the latter achieved no decisive victory. The Spaniards continued to fight bands of Indians until they eventually reached Quito. Finding that all the men had left to join the Inca forces, Benalcazar retaliated by slaughtering their women and children. Meanwhile, other contenders unexpectedly entered the fray. the famous conquistador of Mexico, Pedro de Alvarado, proceeding from Guatemala, landed on the coast of Ecuador in February 1536. Unfamiliar with the harsh conditions of the Andes, his expedition achieved little. Many of his own men and horses froze to death as he tried to penetrate the Cordillera and took the wrong route. On the other hand, Quisquis, who had fought against the Spaniards in central Peru, returned to Ecuador, but he failed to join forces with Rumiñahui. After both generals had been defeated and killed, the Ecuadorian resistance gradually subsided. Inca Puppets. Meanwhile, the Spaniards faced different problems than in Cusco itself. Their efforts to install a series of phantom Inca rulers constitutes a bizarre page in colonial history. The first attempt proved to be short-lived. Soon after Atahualpa's burial as a Christian, Huáscar's younger brother, Tupac Hualpa, was crowned as Inca in Cajamarca. The traditional ceremonies were scrupulously observed, beginning with a 3-day feast of the new ruler in a specially constructed shrine, and ending with his donning the traditional royal fringe as his followers turned their faces toward the sun. But his reign came to a most untimely end. The new Inca died a few months later in October 1533. The Spaniards, dismayed by their loss, believed that Tupac had been poisoned. However, undaunted by this setback, they persisted in their attempt to maintain the fiction of Inca rule and zealously fought a new champion. On entering Cusco in November 1533, they were greeted by Manco, yet another son of Huayna Capac, who outwardly feigned a servile devotion to Spanish rule. Manco was thus duly crowned as heir to his half-brother, an event marked by precisely the same ritual performed as his predecessor. Miguel de Estete gives a vivid account of this ceremony, at which European eyewitnesses could observe so many details of the traditional Inca rituals, including the presence of the mummies of the former kings seated on thrones. Such a vast number of people assembled every day that they could only crowd into a square with great difficulty. Manco had all the dead ancestors brought to the festivities. After he had gone with a great entourage to the temple to make an oration to the sun, throughout the morning he proceeded in rotation to the tombs where each dead Inca was embalmed. They were then removed with great veneration and reverence, and brought into the city seated on their thrones in order of precedence. And there was a litter for each one, with its men in its livery to carry it. The natives came down in this way, singing many ballads and giving thanks to the sun. They reached the square accompanied by innumerable people, and carried the Inca at their head in this litter. His father, Huayna Capac, was level with him, and the rest similarly in their litters, embalmed and with diadems on their heads. A pavilion had been erected for each of them, and the dead kings were placed in order, seated on their thrones and surrounded by pages, and women with fly whisks in their hands, who ministered to them with as much respect as if they had been alive. Beside each was a reliquary or small altar with his insignia, on which were the fingernails, hair, teeth, and other things that had been cut from his limbs after he had been a prince. They remained there from 8 in the morning until nightfall with no law in the festivities. The Spaniards, at this stage in their conquest, as a result of stout resistance, suffered from a sense of insecurity that made them reluctant to suppress forthwith all those heathen rituals so alien to their own faith. Manco was consequently allowed to practice certain traditional ceremonies almost as if nothing had occurred. For instance, in 1535, Cristobal de Molina witnessed the celebration of the feast of Inti Raymi, the hallowed rites dedicated to the harvesting of the maize. On this occasion, the royal mortuary bundles were again paraded, seated under feather awnings. They were attended by nobles traditionally attired with medallions of fine gold on their heels. The rulers' effigies were accompanied by many females, who used fans made of swans' feathers to keep away the flies. The Great Rebellion. Manco, however, proved to be a most inauspicious choice from the point of view of the Spaniards, for whom he had some startling surprises in store. He managed to flee from Cusco, was recaptured, but escaped again on the eve of Easter 1536. His second departure from Cusco heralded the beginning of the Great Inca Rebellion. The whole valley was soon thronged with Indian troops, as a veritable steamroller of warriors closed in from all sides. The Spaniards ensconced within Cusco were staggered by the sheer weight of their opponents' forces, estimated by eyewitnesses as numbering between 1 and 200,000. In contrast to this horde, those besieged within the capital numbered 190, of whom only 80 were mounted. On May 6, 1536, Manco's force launched its main attack on an exiguous band. They even devised new tactics unknown in previous Inca campaigns by arming their slings with red-hot stones wrapped in cotton that would set fire to the thatched roofs. This weapon, incidentally, completed the ruin of the sacred city, already stripped of its treasures for Atahualpa's ransom, and then looted by the Spaniards before being incinerated by its own people. The besieged were eventually cornered in a few buildings at the eastern end of the main square. The attackers developed yet another device, the bola, consisting of 3 stones tied to the end of lengths of llama tendons. But despite their ingenuity, they never developed a weapon that could kill, rather than merely harass a mounted armored horseman. The beleaguered Spaniards eventually resolved that their only hope of salvation lay in the recapture of the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, the base from which the brunt of the Indian attacks was launched. A 2-day struggle ensued in which Francisco Pizarro's younger brother Juan was killed. Finally, the tiny Spanish force, using scaling ladders in a night assault, succeeded in taking the terrace walls of the fortress. 2 further days of bitter fighting ensued, after which the Indian forces took refuge in 2 small towers. When the Spanish finally overcame their resistance, they put the defenders, 1,500 in all, to the sword. The fall of Sacsayhuaman was by no means the end of the siege, which lasted for a further 3 months. From May to August, fighting continued throughout this period, apart from a lull at each new moon, when Indian attacks ceased for the celebration of religious rites. In August, the pressure on the defenders gradually slackened after Gonzalo Pizarro made a sortie and captured 200 Indians. Their right hands were cut off in the middle of the square, and then they were released, thus serving as a grim warning to the besiegers. Part of the vast Indian horde still concentrated in the hills around Cusco began to drift away to sow their crops, and the pressure on the Spaniards in the capital eased. In the meantime, however, Manco had entrusted his general, Giso Yupanqui, with the reconquest of the central highlands of Peru. After a number of victories against isolated groups of Spanish, Giso was eventually ordered to descend upon Francisco Pizarro's new capital, Lima, and destroy it. Following a 6-day investment of the city, Giso launched a full-scale attack, but once more the Spanish cavalry prevailed, and Giso was slain, together with many of his commanders. Manco had meanwhile himself left Cusco, still besieged by his forces, and moved to Ollantaytambo, some 50 kilometers downstream on the Rio Yucay, a great stronghold, part of whose fine Inca masonry still stands almost intact. The siege of Cusco was eventually abandoned after Manco learned of the unexpected arrival of the forces of Diego de Almagro, returning from a triumphant campaign in which he had been ably supported by Paulu, Manco's half-brother, an excellent soldier and a fervent supporter of the Spanish cause. Paulu was very popular, and it was known that Almagro had encouraged him to claim the Inca crown for himself. Manco, learning that the allegiance owed to him by the surviving Inca forces might pass to Paulu, tried to negotiate with Almagro, but his overtures were rejected. Manco eventually abandoned Ollantaytambo and took refuge in the remote province of Vilcabamba, which he ruled as a kind of rump empire. He had managed to mount a second, more extensive rebellion, involving the hostilities in the distant Charcas region beyond Lake Titicaca, which finally ended in the Spanish victory at the Battle of Cochabamba, while other hostilities occurred in the province of Huánuco to the north of Cusco. Manco was eventually murdered in 1545, killed by renegade Spaniards who had fled to his mountain stronghold to escape Spanish justice. The assassins were apprehended by the Incas and tortured to death. Probably by this time the Inca army had been reduced to a few thousand soldiers. Manco's rump empire survived for several decades, successively ruled in its remote fastness by the sons of Manco, until the last emperor, the great Tupac Amaru, finally succumbed to forces sent by the viceroy de Toledo in 1572. There was little opposition. An expedition was sent to the Vilcabamba region. The Indians failed to defend the passes giving access to their territory, and the Spaniards had no difficulty in breaking the last Inca resistance. The great Tupac Amaru and a pathetic band of refugees took to the jungle, where they were soon captured. His 2 leading captains were tortured and executed. Others, less guilty in the eyes of the Spaniards, had only the right hand severed. De Toledo had reached the firm conclusion that these last vestiges of the Inca Empire must now be eliminated, and he determined to execute the surviving emperor, the great Tupac Amaru. After a mock trial, he was sentenced to death. Huge crowds of weeping Indians lined the streets as the last ruler was led to his execution by decapitation. According to the chronicler Martin de Murua, as the multitude of Indians, who completely filled the square, saw that lamentable spectacle and knew that their lord was to die there, they deafened the skies, making them reverberate with their cries and wailing. The Inca then made a most moving final address, in which he asked everyone to forgive him. He told the viceroy and the magistrate that he would pray to God for them. The body of the great Tupac Amaru was interred in the high chapel of the cathedral, the services being performed by the chapter. His head, however, was impaled on the point of a lance. Reportedly, it became more beautiful every day, and at night the Indians would come and adore it. Until the viceroy was informed of this, and the head was then buried with the body in the cathedral chapel. The process of ending this prolonged, if localized period of Inca resistance had taken place against the rather bizarre background of an embittered struggle between several Spanish factions. The conquistadors, far from being united in their determination to crush the rump empire of Manco, were themselves in a state of all-out civil war, amounting to a virtual rebellion against the King of Spain. Initially, Almagro's triumphant forces, having returned from Chile and saved the beleaguered defenders of Cusco, occupied the center of Peru, while those of the three Pizarro brothers, Francisco, Fernando, and Gonzalo, virtually controlled Lima and the coast. Hernando Pizarro proceeded to invade central Peru and reach Cusco, where in 1538 he won a complete victory over Almagro's forces, arrested their leader, and had him garroted. Following this, the defeated Almagrists rallied under their leader's son, also called Diego. A group of 20 forced their way into Francisco Pizarro's apparently unguarded palace in Lima and killed its occupant. With the death of Francisco, the undisputed leader of the Conquest, the whole enterprise entered a new phase, beginning with the dispatch by Charles V of Blasco Núñez to succeed Pizarro as viceroy, with Vaca de Castro as administrator of Peru. Blasco enjoyed only a brief spell of power before he was defeated in a battle fought near Quito in 1545 by the dashing Gonzalo Pizarro, the only Pizarro brother to remain in Peru. As a result of this victory, Gonzalo remained the undisputed master of the situation. Some of the Spanish settlers even wanted to make him king, but he in turn was defeated by a new emissary of the Spanish king, Pedro de la Gasca, at Haquihahuana, near Cusco in 1548, and subsequently executed. The young Diego de Almagro suffered the same fate when about to leave Cusco to join Manco's surviving Inca rebels. The aftermath. Resistance, as we have seen, to the conquistadors was much greater than in many of the other lands they had seized. However, the method of Spanish rule in Peru, once control had been established, followed a pattern that prevailed throughout most of their vast empire. For the average Indian, the changes were gradual, though by this time the Spaniards must have acquired ample experience in the government of Indian lands. The inhabitants, however good their new masters' proclaimed intentions, were subjected to the same abuses. But the direst scourge for the subjects of the newly conquered Inca Empire arose not so much from what their conquerors took, but what they brought with them in the form of hitherto unknown diseases such as measles and smallpox, against which the Native Americans had no immunity. As a result, even according to Spanish official statistics, the population in Peru fell from about 1.5 million in 1561 to 600,000 in 1796. Such statistics probably understated the reduction. The process of depopulation was most marked on the coastal plains. For instance, Chincha, south of Lima, which had been a prosperous valley with reportedly about 40,000 inhabitants when the Spaniards arrived, was reduced to less than 1,000 by the 1560s. Ciudad de León lamented the terrible decline of population due to new diseases in the Ica and Nazca valleys. But while sickness has probably correctly been regarded as the main cause of depopulation, profound cultural shock and an unstable political situation were also major factors. In Peru, unlike Mexico, the demise of the old established order had been preceded by a civil war among the conquerors, and, following the overthrow of the Inca Empire by wholly alien foreigners, both the staunch resistance after the conquest and the hostilities between warring Spanish factions also took their toll. Famine, resulting from the prevailing disorder, added to the horrors of war. To cite a simple example of the additional sufferings imposed upon the Indians' population by fighting between Spanish factions, when Gonzalo Pizarro was advancing upon Lima, he conscripted 6,000 men and women to transport his army's baggage and artillery. According to his main adversary, De la Gasca, most of these conscripts died as a result of porterage, scorched by the sun and exhausted by the weight of their loads. They were tied by chains by day and thrown into stocks by night to prevent escape. The Spaniards' hold over the Indians was based, in Peru as in Mexico, on a system of land grants known as encomiendas. As early as 1529, the part of the understanding that Francisco Pizarro would undertake the conquest of Peru at his own expense, he had been granted the right to offer encomiendas to his people, provided that he observed certain restrictions on the use of forced labor. Thus, in effect, the King of Spain offered incentives for Spanish not only to conquer, but to settle in conquered territories by offering them a life of privileged existence, in an age when land was the true measure of wealth among men who, unlike the future settlers of Northern America, would have despised the very notion of engaging in trade, let alone performing in manual labor. The Encomienda granted to a Spaniard did not itself confer land. The recipients, known as encomenderos, were simply entrusted with the Christian welfare of a host of Indians living with a specified territory, for whom they in return received tribute. Hence, the encomendero's reward. The incentive for him to settle in Peru was the chance to live a life of luxury at the expense of the inhabitants of his encomienda. Unless rigidly controlled, the system was open to the grossest abuses. It might be one thing in Spain itself, but quite another when the control of the hordes of Indians was entrusted to unprincipled individuals of alien race, who were more apt to regard them as mere beasts of burden. Unlike the previous rulers, these privileged few cared little for those with whose welfare they were charged, and in many cases exacted their tribute without ever setting eyes on their subjects, since they were obliged to reside in a Spanish municipality and forbidden to live within the bounds of their own domain. Virtually any soldier who had been in Cajamarca, regardless of social origin, could have an encomienda on a condition that he remained in Peru. Pizarro tended to give the largest and best territories to his own relatives and servants, and one illiterate conquistador was entrusted with 40,000 vassals. The mita system of labor service was continued by these Spaniards, who turned it to their own profit. Whereas the metallos conscripted for labor service were previously supported from state storehouses, the Spaniards gave them nothing in return for their labor. The most fearsome form of mita was conscription to work in the Spanish mines, where the demand for labor was vastly increased by the discovery in 1545 of the fabulous silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia, previously unknown. The silver was close to the surface, and initially the Indian miners were more or less fairly treated. But by 1550, the demand for labor was so great that Potosi came to be compared to a ravenous monster gulping down the native population. Imported African slaves could not survive at the high altitude of the mines. Friar Domingo de Santo Tomas was among the first to draw attention to the horrific scene in writing to the Council of the Indies in 1550. Some 4 years ago, to the complete perdition of this land, there was discovered a month of hell, into which a great mass of people enter every year and are sacrificed by the greed of the Spaniards to their quote-unquote God. This is your silver mine called Potosi. The wretched Indians are sent to this mountain from every repartimiento. To be thrown into forest by the mines is the condition of slaves or of men condemned to serve punishment for grave crimes. The higher Spanish authorities, from the king downwards, sought to protect the natives of Peru from exploitation by local residents, but the effect of their efforts was somewhat limited. As early as 1542, the Council of the Indies was established, and in theory, at least, the Indians were to be protected by the new laws issued at Barcelona in that year. Under their provisions, royal rule was extended to the provinces by the use of officials known as corregidores, who were instructed to punish offenses against Indians as severely as if they had been inflicted upon Spaniards. But it was rare in practice for these local officials to punish the encomenderos, and most of the population were scarcely aware of the existence of other powers, apart from their immediate masters, the encomenderos and the previous lords, the curacas. The traditional curacas, or local Indian chieftains, were in effect caught between two fires. On the one hand, they themselves tended to bear the brunt of Spanish cruelty, since they were thought to control much of the treasure so avidly sought by the conquerors. Atrocities against curacas were not infrequent. Some were tortured and hanged. Others were put into pits up to their waists and then pressed for gold. But after the initial hunt for treasure, the curacas, far from being treated as responsible for hoarding gold, came to be regarded as a useful asset in the task of controlling their previous subjects, since the encomenderos were forbidden to live on their lands and therefore needed the help of these curacas to extract tribute. Far from being deprived of their former powers under the Inca state, many curacas ultimately joined the Spaniards in exploiting the local population. Nonetheless, while some curacas clearly abused their newfound autonomy, others sought to protect their former subjects, and certain accounts tell of efforts by the best of them to defend their Indians from Spanish abuse. Apart from the encomendero and the curaca, the Spaniards with whom Indians had the most direct contact were the priests. Of these, while some strove to protect their flock of new converts from abuse, others did little more than add by their claims to the weight of tribute paid by the local population. While ostensibly the initial purpose of the Spanish conquest of the Indians had been their conversion and the salvation of their souls, in practice, the Church as a whole had been far from united in its attitude. Long previous to the conquest of Peru, the pro-Indian movement had found a champion in the indefatigable Bishop Bartolomé de las Casas, whose invective forced the Spanish crown to pass a series of new laws designed, at least in theory, to protect initially the native peoples of Mexico and subsequently those of Peru. The Spanish monarchs had been profoundly troubled by a growing debate over their moral rights to rule and conquer Indians. This debate grew ever more passionate, culminating in a gathering of 10 members of the Council of the Indies in a Castilla in Valladolid in 1550. Las Casas prepared a treatise of 550 pages, which he read in seriation for 5 consecutive days. Notwithstanding the contrary opinions given by others, such as the humanist Juan de Sepúlveda, who defended Spanish rights to rule the Indians as they thought fit, the views of Las Casas tended to prevail, and he continued to put forth diatribes against misrule until his death in 1566. He even proposed that the King of Spain, for the sake of his soul's salvation, should restore all Peru to Titu Cusi, the puppet Inca ruler. But theorizing on the moral rights of the conquerors, however well-intentioned, was somewhat remote from the realities of life and social conditions of the native people of Peru, and as we have seen, there was little improvement. It was not until the arrival of Viceroy Francisco de Toledo in 1571 that changes were made in practice. Toledo, somewhat paradoxically, sought to withdraw from circulation the writings of Las Casas and displayed a certain sympathy for the natives' oppressors, the Encomenderos. But while attempts to suppress the Encomiendas failed, their importance tended to decline. Toledo also sought to curb the powers of the Caracas, whom he regarded as petty tyrants. Control of the Indians was now entrusted to the corregidores, appointed for only a few years. Some, at least, sought to relieve their sufferings, but their efforts were often frustrated by the voracious demands of the mines for labor under conditions that failed to improve. After the last shadow ruler, the great Tupac Amaru, had been executed following a mock trial, the surviving nobility by the end of the 16th century was increasingly assimilated and came to identify itself with the conquerors. So marked had been the Inca impact on the core regions of their great domain that Inca traditions and customs were slow to fade, and certain forms of Inca solidarity were not altogether extinguished. The simmering resentment against the Spanish overlords eventually led to an open revolt that broke out in 1737 and spread over 17 provinces before it was ruthlessly put down. A subsequent revolt was led by a man named Santos, who took the title of Apu Inca, thus claiming to link himself with Atahualpa. Somewhat paradoxically, this revolt flourished in the jungle lying beyond the confines of the former empire. The rebel Inca was never captured, since he managed to retreat to the forest whenever he was pursued. Another important uprising took place in 1780 to 1781 and was led by a Caraca, Gabriel Condorcanqui, who took the title of Tupac Amaru II, after the last shadow Inca, whose daughter had married Condorcanqui's great-grandfather. This was in effect a peasant revolt, which culminated in the hanging of a prominent Spanish corregidor. But after his initial triumph, the great Tupac Amaru II was captured, tortured, and then executed in the main square of Cusco. Yet a further rebellion by Indian leaders, who claimed descent from the Incas, took place in 1815, only 9 years before the Battle of Ayacucho, which led to Peruvian independence from Spain. This concludes Chapter 9 and this book.